girls experienced the wilderness, tested themselves physically and mentally, and participated in new activities. Moreover, this pushed the boundaries of femininity and gave girls the opportunity to develop a lifelong interest in wilderness, physical activity, and redefine their perception of what they were capable of doing, both with their bodies and with their lives. Thank you.
A couple of the pictures you'll find in the archives, and you won't find in the promotional brochures, is some of the Tanakun ladies smoking cigarettes. And it wasn't on the promotional brochures, but it was on the other places. Think of Bessie Pitt, 1925 graduate from Margaret Eaton School, and chatting with her. She went with Mary Hamilton up to Algonquin Park, and they went to this rock and sat on this rock, and Mary goes, "This is it. This is where we're going to build the camp." And so it's just kind of interesting hearing these stories. Although the archives are paper, we thought it might be good to do a little oral history as part of the conference. So we've invited the great-grandson of the founding principal to come and join us and share some oral history. Bob, welcome.
Thank you. So how's your conference going?
It's amazing. It's amazing. It's amazing.
I'm sorry I'm late.
Yeah, you missed. Well, we actually videotape all the sessions.
There we go.
So
Okay.
you can catch me Raleigh later on again too. So perfect. Thank you.
I had that phenomenon. I was asked to speak at Google, which is for a guy in tech, is sort of a great honor. So you go to Google and you're thinking, well, there's thousands of employees. So this could be the biggest talk I've ever given. So unlike my normal talks, I actually prepared something. Only to show up in an auditorium with 5 people. And so now I'm offended. You know? No one cares.
You nailed it. So
it turns out that no one at Google ever goes to these Google Talks because they all watch them online. So it was probably, in fact, the biggest audience I'd ever had. I was just oblivious to it. So that's the goal here today. Is you got to tell all your friends about all these brilliant presentations and get them all to watch them online and create the biggest audience for a Redeemer College conference that has ever been.
there we go.
So here's why I love John Byatt, just for the record, is where he and I bond is we have this quirk. So our society is full of this male-female debate. What's the role of men? What's the role of women? Are men being properly nice to women, or women being... It just gets a little tiring. I don't know about you guys. I find it gets tiring. And what I like about John is he doesn't see the difference. This is interesting stuff. And we're all humans first, and we're male and female second. And I got this directly from my father. And it's a tradition in my father's family. Here's your oral history bit. Because it goes back as many generations as I could sort of, because I'm a history guy, not that I'm an academic at all, but I enjoy history. It's just the stuff that gets me out of bed in the morning. And he was always convinced that women were not the fairer sex, the finer sex. If you had to choose which was better, men or women, he was unequivocal. Women were the better sex. And his thesis was women cared about people more than men did. There's vast generality. So some women don't care about people. Some men really care about people. But as a general rule, men cared about things, stuff, architecture, process. Women cared about the people involved. And so he said, and that's why we're on the planet, is to make the world a better place for other people. That's why we get out of bed in the morning. If you're not getting out of bed in the morning to make the world a better place, don't get out of bed. And then his other thesis was you're getting out of bed, the definition of making the world a better place is to make someone else's world a better place. And so that's his thought, and that's where John and I bonded from the first moment. So John got intrigued. Well, I'm sure, have you already told
I
your
have.
story?
I've
Okay, good.
shared my story.
So, stumbling into this phenomenon that the Margaret Eaton School had this remarkable impact, such that, what was your statistics? I keep making up my own statistics because I can never remember yours.
Well, the one with the YWCA
Yeah, the
is that
YWCA.
they dominated the physical education directors in Canada in the 30s.
Diane, such a pleasure to meet you. Sorry.
Yeah, so all the physical education directors in Canada in the YWCA's were Margaret Eaton School graduates.
Sorry, how many of, say that again?
I would say all of, pretty well, not, yeah, pretty well all of the
Wow.
YWCA directors in Canada.
Because I was remembering a number of something like 40 out of 41.
Yeah, so
But that's pretty
probably
much-
what it was. Yeah, okay, that's probably what it was, yeah.
Okay, so John stumbles across this fact and just changes his thesis to go, hey, now that's interesting, we should do a study on that. So he ends up doing this study on a school founded by my great-grandmother. And I had heard of my great-grandmother from my mother, who talked about her in these overblown, sort of exaggerated descriptions of who her great and how important Emma Scott Raff was. Born Emma Scott, she married a fellow of German extraction who in turn, Mr. Raff's father or grandfather was Joachim Raff. And for those of you who are into music, Joachim Raff was a minor contemporary of Beethoven's. So you will occasionally hear a symphony composed by Joachim Raff, who will then be my great-great-great-great-grandfather. So somewhere up in that range. So Emma Scott, small-town girl from Owen Sound, gets into theater and does what girls with wanderlust who get into theater do, and goes on a road trip, basically, in the late 19th century, so in that late 19th century, so 80 or 90, and is barnstorming around the United States with this theater troupe, and falls in love with a mining promoter out of Denver or Aspen, has a child with him in Denver or Aspen, such that my parents, and they had known he died of tuberculosis. That was part of the family history. So when I was 16, we had a family holiday, Christmas, we spent in Aspen skiing. And my parents were going to the local cemeteries to see if they could find, I think his first name was George, but anyways, Mr. Raff's tombstone, and they couldn't. They visited 3 or 4 cemeteries, no Mr. Raff anywhere. It wasn't until John started doing this Margaret Eaton School story. One of his students, one of your students, comes across a video that I had put up on YouTube. How much of this story should I tell? These are all strings.
Yeah, no, I missed
tie
that,
together.
yeah.
So the story was my father had these tins of film in the back of his closet. And when I was growing up, we moved several times, and these boxes of these tins of film moved from one house to the other in the back of my father's closet. Didn't matter which house we were in the back of the closet were these tins of film. And I asked him what were in the tins of film. He says, well, I don't actually know because I don't have a projector, but nor do I have the heart to throw them out because they were old family movies of some sort from somewhere. So of course, my father lives a full and happy and successful life and passes away at age 85. And now we're cleaning out his closets, and there are the tins of film. So there were 2 things I couldn't do. I couldn't throw away tins of film that my father had dragged from house to house through his life, but nor was I gonna put the tins of film in the back of my closet. So I found a service that I could send my tins of film to, who would digitize the film. And I was certain, this was a long shot, but I was certain the service was gonna say, no, the film is altered, it's too brittle, it's turned to powder, nothing we can do with it. You know, here are your tins back. Instead of which, because my father had never opened the tins, oxygen never got to them, they hadn't oxidized, and they were in fact digitizable. So now we have these, and they were mostly films by my grandfather, Robert Fennell, who I was named after, who was a amateur home movie guy in the 1920s. So the earliest of these films has my mother as a baby. She was born in 1925. Film was developed in what, 1920, 1918, something like that, before it became sort of widely available. And he was making home movies 5 years after the invention of film, which is really interesting. Anyway, they're goofy little films, you know, and film was clearly very expensive. His scenes in these films were very short. So he would film for 2 minutes and then put the camera away. And then 2 weeks later, you'd have a different scene of 2 minutes worth of film. One of the films was of these two people in a canoe, a very tall, stately woman, and a very short fellow in uniform. And again, family oral histories, my mother had told me how her grandmother had her grandmother, so my great-grandmother had my grandmother, her mother, with Mr. Rath, who then died from tuberculosis. And then got remarried in the middle of the First World War to a Colonel Naismith. And it was one of these great love stories of two people who bonded over shared interests. And that's the only thing these two human beings had together. They're clearly both very intellectual people. And they just loved each other, despite the fact that one of them was a 6-foot-tall woman who, you know, was a take charge, highly social human being, could have had her, you know, any man in Toronto, but fell in love with a 4'9" colonel in the Canadian military who had been drafted into the Canadian military because he was a chemist. And they needed chemists on the front lines to build the sewer systems and to manage the latrines, the infrastructure of several 100,000 men in a community in the front lines. And he was there when the Germans first started using mustard gas. And smelling mustard gas, he recognized, being a chemist, that the correct thing to do was, you'll love this story, was to get the men to pull out their handkerchiefs, urinate in their handkerchiefs, and breathe through that. Because the ammonia in your urine will neutralize the chlorine and the mustard gas. And it's a very unpleasant way to survive, but you survive mustard gas attacks. And that was the original concept of gas masks that he was credited with doing. But he was just that kind of human being. He was just a curious, interested, forward-leaning kind of guy whose job was to build sewer systems, but didn't think of his role on the planet as being defined by the job. If soldiers were dying because of mustard gas, he was going to find a solution to that problem.
The other major solution he provided was water purification.
Yes.
And it says pure water purification, which the Fowlers actually had his invention when we got before, but they had sold it before we got the collection from the Fowlers, so it's somebody else owns it, but we don't know who. That was another invention of his.
Okay. So, and then I'll be interested in what you guys want to hear, but the cute little story, by the way, on the videos that I put up, because I put them up on YouTube, not because I want anyone to see them, I wanted my cousins to see them. And I have cousins all over the world, including Australia, and I didn't want to have to ship CDs all over the world. world, and these were digitized, why ship CDs? So put them up on YouTube and then send email to all your cousins and say, hey, come, go visit your family history on YouTube. And that was very successful. But when I put them up, again, family history, I knew by reputation who tall Emma Scott Raff was and short Colonel Naismith. So when I saw this little clip of them in a canoe, I thought, that's Emma Scott and Colonel Naismith. So I put a little description on that piece of film when I put it up on YouTube, Emma Scott Raff and Colonel Naismith. John had one of his students researching Emma Scott Raff, does a Google search, and up pops my video. Apparently within like a week of me putting the video up there. I mean, the coincidence was really quite charming. And so John calls the Tiger Cat office and goes, this is a really long shot phone call, but could Mr. Young be the same Bob Young who just put up a video on YouTube about Emma Scott Raff? And of course I was. And that's when we bonded. That was our first connection. But what I love about all of these stories, and what the last presentation was just how human all these stories are. And you know, we all think we're liberating women, or we're all still the same people we were in Cleopatra's day. We just live within different societal mores, so we change our behaviors a little bit, but not a lot. They're still the same characters through history. And the role of my father's thesis, that women are the finer sex, relates to my success. So I had, like most of us, two parents. Like most of us, I had very human parents. All I remember growing up is their failings. They were complete jerks to me for 20 years. And then I eventually forgave them for that, and we became friends. But you know, the usual dynamic. But as I put it, the trick to success is really two things. One is choose your parents well, and the other is choose your spouse well. I had brilliant parents. The more I think about it, the more I research them. But they in turn were brilliant thanks to their brilliant parents. And all of my success, so my father was this really good academic, and I love academics. My whole secret of success, I was the dumbest guy in the room. I still am, especially in this room. So my secret to success was to embrace the idea that I'm the dumbest guy in the room and associate with all the smart people in the room, because they'll make me look good. Turns out that was exactly my mother's route to success. So she never graduated high school, marries this guy, my father, who was a bit of a, in his day, a geek. His head was always in a book, but he's a very smart geek, and so he got himself to Cambridge University after the war, where he studied economics. From there, he went to Harvard Business School, and from there, he had a big career in building financial service companies. But yet, all of my success comes directly from my mother. So my brother David inherited some of my father's ability with numbers. He's a smart guy, unlike me. I take after my mother. I did graduate high school, but just barely. You know, this is back in the 70s when we didn't used to worry about self-esteem of our students. So the teachers would put the marks of the exam up on the classroom door. And I used to think they were put up alphabetically, because they explained why young So I scraped through high school, and then I scraped through university, and then I've had some success. And all of my success is a direct result of my mother's ability to tell a story. And my mother came by that honestly because she worshipped her grandmother, Emma Scott Raff. And you can just, reading the archives, you know Emma Scott Raff is one of the great storytellers of our time. And that's where my success directly comes from. It has nothing to do with my Cambridge University, Harvard-educated father. It was all my mother's ability to tell a story. And that's what I do, I tell stories. I tell stories that motivate my teammates in my business as to what we are trying to achieve. And then I find smarter people than me to actually go out and achieve that. My job is just to tell the story. And it works. And it's how the world works. We love stories. That's what history is. It is stories. And it's why it's such a pleasure to be associated with what John's doing here with the archive and with the conference today.
Thank you, but other questions maybe? If you have a question of Bob, about his great-grandmother, or any of that family history? Some questions, you have your chance.
What was her favorite story?
Which, my great-grandmother's or my mother's favorite?
Your grandmother.
I only have so it's a story about my mother, but I bet this comes honestly all the way down from my grandmother. So by extension, there's probably some inspiration here, which was when I was 12 years old. So my older brothers, David would have been 14, Michael, my oldest brother, would have been 16. My father sat us down, had a very serious conversation with his three sons. And it was because we were making our mother very unhappy. Because we were now young adults, and so they were inviting us to sit with the grown-ups when they would have a party. And my mother would be telling a story. And we would constantly be going, Mom, you didn't have 100 people over for dinner, there were only 12 of us. And of course, my mother was just telling a story, and she was great at telling stories to entertain her guests, would be thrown off the story and would get really annoyed with her rude children who were, in effect, being rude to her in front of her guests. So she assigns her meek and mild husband to sit down with those rotten children and straighten them up for her. So Dad dutifully sits us down and says, boys, you can't interrupt your mother like that. She's just entertaining our guests, where our guests are our guests in our house. They're not here to listen to us squabble as a family. And we go, but Dad, she wasn't telling the truth. And then we've been raised to tell the truth. This is not right. So we had a negotiation. And the negotiation said, so when is the truth the truth? It was a very metaphysical, very academic sort of, when is the truth the truth? So when is a story representative of what actually happened versus tightly descriptive of what happened? And a good story is always representative because the facts get in the way of a good story, as you know. We ended up settling, you'll love this, a factor of 10. So if Mom had 9 people over for dinner, and she said, I'm so tired, I had 100 people over for dinner, we were allowed to interrupt. But if we had 11 people over for dinner, and she says, I'm so exhausted, we had 100 people over for dinner, we were not allowed to interrupt. And my guess is that exaggeration factor, which creeps into many of my own stories, so you're gonna have to decide for yourselves whether any of these stories have any truth to them at all. My guess is that exaggeration factor goes all the way back to Emma Scott Raff. And the reason for it, and this is where I refer to her as the inspiration, and I'm sure in turn she had mothers and grandmothers who inspired her. I'm an entrepreneur. I start businesses. That's what I do. Everything else, I don't run the businesses particularly well, but I start businesses. And there's a long Shaggy Dog story as to why I'm excited about doing that and why it's a passion. But as a result of starting business, you're looking at all businesses, all organizations all the time as to whether, I could start one of those. Well, there are certain things that are incredibly difficult to make successful, and schools are one of them. The reason most schools that you can name are 100 or 200 years old is because it's really hard to start a new one. Most new schools fail very quickly. Once you get that school established, it'll last for 200 years. But it's hard to get a school established, and Emma Scott Raff managed to get the Margaret Eaton School for Girls established, managed to turn it into an institution. Eventually it merged with the University of Toronto and it sort of faded away from history as a result of that merger. But nonetheless, she built a school from scratch and built a very successful school from scratch. She is the very definition in my world of an entrepreneur who I admire, never having met her, just as a result of her accomplishment.
Good. Maybe one more question if somebody has?
If I may, a football question?
Sure.
Well, I want to ask you whether you think the Ticats are going to end up making the playoffs, but I'm more interested in your opinion about the latest focus on head injuries in football and what the impact of that might have on the game.
It's going to have a huge impact on me. Our new commissioner, Randy Ambrosi, and I were chatting about this the other day, and we see a real possibility that we may be running the professional flag football league. Don't quote me, by the way. No tweeting that statement. But it gives you an idea of just how serious we are taking the issue. A lot of the issue is behind us, but it won't appear that way for another decade. In other words, in the 50s and 60s, once they had developed the hard helmet, coaches realized you could use this helmet to your advantage, to the other team's disadvantage by using it violently. And I used to play football really badly, but I played football. And I loved playing football, even though I played it really badly. And I don't know if we're allowed to talk about this as guys, but you know, guys are naturally rough and tumble, whether our bodies are designed that way or whether we're too stupid to know that it's not actually a good idea to break your leg, or in my case, your leg and your jaw, or in my case, your leg and your jaw and your arm several times, because I would do stupid things, whereas all my female cousins wouldn't break things because they wouldn't do stupid things. Of course, I admire people who do stupid things, so I marry a girl who broke every bone in her body as a skier for the Quebec ski team. Coming back to concussions, what we didn't know then, and brain science is only now teaching us, is just how dangerous concussions are, especially repetitive concussions. And we're still learning, because the odd thing about brain science is there is clearly a connection, if you've had multiple concussions, to this CPE syndrome, where it's in effect and I've been doing some of this research because my mother and a couple of members of her family all passed away from versions of Alzheimer's. And Nancy's, my wife's Nancy's family is full of Alzheimer's, so I'm very interested in the whole Alzheimer's thing. And so there's connections there, but they're not one-to-one relationships. So just because you had a lot of concussions doesn't mean you ever get Alzheimer's. And just because you have Alzheimer's doesn't mean you ever had a concussion. But there is clearly a very real and significant statistical link between people who have had multiple concussions and people who get Alzheimer's-like illnesses later in life. Some of them quite early in life. That awful story of the Patriots, New England Patriots player who became a murderer and started killing people
Hernandez.
for fun. And it turns out he had quite severe, what is the term, CPE, is it?
Yes.
He had quite severe CPE at age 25 or 26. So this is a very serious issue, and we just have to stop encouraging people. Well, we have already stopped encouraging people to use their heads as weapons in football, but we actually have to change the rules of our game to reduce that risk even further.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Sharing.
Yeah.
And just as a thank you for your support for this conference too, just the plaque here with the speakers and so on. So
That's very
just as
cool.
a member.
So now all I need is my own building, and I can put this up as a
There you go. Well, maybe
So thank
maybe
you
the
so
Football Hall of Fame or something like that.
There we